I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere celebrates the 125th birthday of an iconic Sherlock Holmes.
Oh, Watson, the needle. Very effective, my dear Watson. Elementary, my dear Holmes.
This is the voice you have learned to fear. This is the voice of terror.
The needle to the lance. Eh, Holmes? The man who had it didn't know he had it. Come in, Watson. My dear fellow, I'm glad to find you here. There's your killer. Poor innocent child. I should have prevented this. Nonsense, my dear chap. You did everything possible. Am I likely to forget the Oxton Creeper? Oxton Creeper? Oxton Horror, I called him. Oh, we could knock the wall down for you. What you don't realize, Mr. Stride, is they're desperate. They'd stop at nothing. And they've got Dr. Watson.
To walk together through the gates of eternity, hand in hand. Charming picture that would make us, wouldn't it? I really think it might be worth it.
I pay sufficient credit to your good taste to take the beautiful for granted.
The diamond's gone. Gone? Your piano lessons were not in vain, old fellow. You've solved it. Thank you.
Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
And Sherlock Holmes and the Cryptic Clues, A Grave Undertaking by Michael McClure.
And the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Subscriptions available at bakerstreetjournal.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 122. Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Walder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Wow. This is going to be quite a time today here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Walder.
And boy, oh boy, do we have some fun in store. We have an episode ahead of us that folks have been asking for a long time.
Oh, I'm really excited. This is something we've talked about for a long time and wanted to do for a long time. And the calendar tells us it's so appropriate.
Yes.
Because, as you realize,
it's someone's birthday.
Yes.
Happy birthday, Bert.
Oh no. Thank you. I'm only 125 years old. Oh, no. That's Philip St. John Basil Rathbone is 125 on June 25th. Is that his birthday?
June 13th, just 2 days ago.
Oh, dear. June
Yes.
13th.
I know. Now you're going to have to send him an apology. Sorry I missed your birthday card.
Yeah,
My goodness.
True. I never know what to get somebody. You know, oddly enough, when you go to the Hallmark store, there are no cards that says Happy 125th birthday. I wonder why.
Well, you know, 50, you get gold, 75, diamond, 125, oxygen. Something to help people breathe and make it to 126, I guess.
You know, one of the things that's always, first of all, I've been, like you, I've been a big fan of Basil Rathbone's Sherlock Holmes for years and years. So an opportunity to devote some time to remembering all those classic films is really great.
Yes.
But in preparing for this and thinking about it, and you look at the calendar, you'll realize that Basil Rathbone was born in 1892, and Nigel Bruce was born in 1895. So contrary to what one might think, Rathbone is actually 3 years older than Nigel Bruce. But the other interesting thing about this which we haven't actually had a chance to talk about, is I realized the other day, do you know what's interesting from a Sherlockian perspective about Rathbone's birthday?
I do not.
The year 1892?
Well, it's the year that the Wisteria Lodge was supposed to have taken place, which it couldn't have.
No. Not. Oh, really? Wisteria Lodge?
Yeah.
That can't be the case. Well, it depends on what chronology you're looking at. So final. If you think that the final problem happened in April of 1891,
yes,
then 1892 is of interest because it's during the Great Hiatus.
That's right,
and therefore. And I shall obviously have to write a paper about this and send it to Stephen Rothman for the Baker Street Journal. It's perfectly possible that while Holmes was wandering through Tibet, what he was actually doing was fathering Basil Rathbone. And that accounts for quite a lot, including that odd resemblance between Rathbone and all of those drawings by Sidney Paget.
That could be. That could very well be. Well, we know, of course, that Rathbone was born in South Africa. So I don't know that Holmes ever made it through there. Although they did send, who was it? Young Gilchrist from the Three Students. He was banished to Rhodesia to join the Rhodesian police. Of course, folks at home, if you're playing our home game, you'll know Rhodesia now as Zimbabwe. That is so. Yeah, it was Wisteria Lodge where Watson himself says, "I find it recorded in my notebook that it was a bleak and windy day towards the end of March in the year 1892."
Well, that can't be the case because final problem happened in 1891 and Empty House happened in 1894. So Watson. It must be a coffee stain in Watson's note.
That maybe Watson was covering for Holmes's paternity leave here. It was a double blind.
That's
Who knows? Well, we want to cover one thing before we jump into more Rathbonian topics here, and I believe one of those things we want to cover is our friends at Wessex Press.
The ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex is about to celebrate Midsummer Eve, the festival of the summer solstice, when we light bonfires to protect against evil spirits. But you will be safe once you buy your copy of the Drury Lane Theater Mystery, an original Sherlock Holmes screen treatment by Dennis Hoey from WessexPress.com. What if Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce had made one more movie? This previously unknown screen treatment by Inspector Lestrade himself is a backstage mystery set in London's Drury Lane Theatre. It includes comments and background from Dennis Hoey's son, Michael. Summer is the time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth and every common sight, to us may seem apparelled in celestial light. It's the perfect time to reach for the pleasure only a volume from the Wessex Press can provide. Choose yours today.
Well,
the big problem, when you're dealing with these ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdoms is, it's like everything else. I have mechanical watches, and every so often, they do need to be adjusted and cleaned and wound. But when you try to do that with Stonehenge, my goodness, it's difficult. You have to bring in the bulldozers.
Well, that's why
sextants.
That's why it was a group project. There was a whole cult involved there.
That's right.
Crazy. Well, we're not here to talk about Stonehenge or cults or anything else like that. We're here to talk about Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, as we promised. They, of course, are the definitive Holmes and Watson for, I would say, a number of generations. Not just the generation that grew up in the 30s and 40s. Because these are films, and there were, 14 films in all? With Rathbone and Bruce, and of course their wonderful radio series. These are portrayals that have gone on to be played and replayed in countless theaters and television stations and in homes all across the world. I think at a time that was very critical. This is only about or less than 10 years after Conan Doyle's death. about a decade after the final Sherlock Holmes story appeared in print from its original publication, that the Sherlock Holmes interest was alive and well. This is around the time that the Baker Street Irregulars was formed, and about the same time that the Baker Street Journal was coming into at least conception. So it was really at a height of Holmes mania, much like we are seeing in the current day, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. Why don't we actually talk about some of the films and the roles that we're here to talk about under this amazing series? Of course, it all started with Fox Studios. There were 2 films under 20th Century Fox that were made. There were 12 that were made under the Universal banner. But let's begin at the beginning, when at the end of October 1938, Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce had signed on to star in The Hound of the Baskervilles. You know, if you're going to start a new movie series, there really isn't a much better Holmes story to start with than The Hound of the Baskervilles. This was a film that, or a story, I should say, that had been attempted to be brought to the screen previously, but the Rathbone-Bruce version really became the definitive version, and I think still is today, because although The Hound of the Baskervilles is just a master class in storytelling from Conan Doyle, it's also a difficult one to film, just in terms of getting all the elements in and characterizing the dog itself, and it really has not successfully been brought to screen in a remarkable way, other than this 1939 version.
And what a cast! In addition to casting Rathbone and Bruce, they also cast Richard Greene, who had a famous role on television in the 50s as Robin Hood, as Sir Henry Baskerville, and Lionel Atwill, who we'll see again in the years ahead as Dr. Mortimer.
Yes, love Lionel Atwill. And speaking of Dr. Mortimer, it is he who we meet in the first scenes of The Hound of the Baskervilles, just like in the story. And he has that wonderful quote that still, at least in my case, raises the hairs on the back of my neck.
I have information which leads me to believe that for centuries past, every Baskerville who's inherited the estates has met with a violent and sudden death.
But as I recall it, Sir Charles died from natural causes, heart failure.
Apparently. And that was the verdict of the coroner, in which I, as Sir Charles' physician, concurred. But there was one point which I kept back from the police, from everybody.
Yes?
About 50 yards from where Sir Charles fell dead were footprints.
A man's or a woman's?
Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound.
Oh, I love that.
Bum, 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 bum.
Yeah.
One of the best chapter ends in any story.
Really?
And we should also mention that in Hound of the Baskervilles, we also had the first appearance of Mary Gordon as Mrs. Hudson. So we will be seeing her again.
Yes. Yeah, I love how they made fair use of a number of not only recurring roles, but recurring actors in different roles. As you said, Lionel Atwill will make another appearance, although in a different form later on. But one interesting bit of trivia about The Hound of the Baskervilles is as they put together this Dartmoor set, in order to really make it look believable, realistic, they pumped fog in to the set for the duration of the filming. I guess it was over the course of many weeks. And at the end of it, the artificial fog reportedly cost $93,000. Not a small amount in those days. So.
And the lovely thing about this at the time was this was Rathbone's first opportunity to really create the character of Sherlock Holmes, and he apparently looked back on that with a great deal of fondness and pride.
He did, and I even in his autobiography, In and Out of Character, I think he still had warm feelings for this particular outing as Holmes. Mm. So, and there was I think a few things to quibble with. It was fairly faithful, but of course you had the seance scene, which interestingly actually touched into Conan Doyle's own interest in spiritualism. And strangely, you had Barrymore, the butler, and his wife. He was renamed Berryman. Mm. Why do you think that would have been, Bert?
Oh, well, that's because of John Barrymore. And I think at that point, Barrymore's star certainly had faded a bit. And the idea of having a butler named Barrymore, particularly with how visible John Barrymore was, but not only that, Ethel and Lionel Barrymore.
Yeah, don't forget Lionel. And Happy New Year to you in jail.
Friends, it's the only place you're going to hear an impression of Lionel Barrymore this week. And a good impression. But, I think it was feared that, particularly in the film community, that would seem to be a sort of a gratuitous insult. And it's an easy enough thing to change the name of Barrymore to Berryman. And Berryman was played by, I just blanked on his name. One of my favorite actors, Martha Plimpton's uncle.
John Carradine?
Yes, Carradine, right.
Well, old what's-his-name? My favorite actor, old what's-his-name?
Yes.
Oh, well.
Where's my Google-assisted memory?
So when it was released, it was actually reviewed quite favorably. And let's not forget, 1939 was quite a year for movies. You had Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz.
Sure.
A number of, films that still remain in the collective consciousness today. So in The Spectator, Graham Greene wrote, in this new film, Holmes is undoubtedly Holmes, and he hasn't to compete desperately with telephones and high-speed cars and 1939. The atmosphere of unmechanical Edwardian flurry is well caught. The villain bowls recklessly along Baker Street in a hansom, and our hero discusses plans for actions in a four-wheeler. So that period very astutely maintained by 20th Century Fox.
Right. Very well received, and so well received that just a little bit more than 2 months after The Hound opened in the cinema, good old 20th Century Fox began work on the second Sherlock Holmes film, which was The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which was supposed to be an adaptation of the William Gillette play. But it really depends on your definition of adaptation. If you think an adaptation is typed because the original was typed and has Sherlock Holmes in it because the original had Sherlock Holmes in it, then this is in fact an adaptation. But other than that, there's nothing at all in The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes that links to that original Gillette play by the time they got done with the script writing.
Yeah. And this wasn't the first time that Gillette's play had been adapted for the screen. Of course, we know that Gillette himself did so very faithfully in 1916, and that silent film was recently rediscovered in the last couple of years. We wrote about that, of course, on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. We actually broke the news. But it had also been adapted for the screen in 1932.
That's by Clive
20th Century
Brooke.
Fox. Yeah, Clive Brooke. But, 7 years later, well, that was old news. And you've got the new Sherlock Holmes on your hands. So, in this case, we've got an ingenious plot by good old Moriarty, who wants to stage a robbery of the crown jewels out of the Tower of London. And, We'll let Lionel Atwill as Moriarty tell us all about it himself.
Holmes, you've only now barely missed sending me to the gallows. You're the one man in England clever enough to defeat me. The situation has become impossible.
Have you any suggestions?
I'm going to break you, Holmes. I'm going to bring off right under your nose the most incredible crime of the century, and you'll never suspect it until it's too late. That will be the end of you, Mr. Sherlock Holmes.
Not quite as bone-chilling as they were the footprints of a gigantic hound, but still enough to leave an impact, right?
Yeah, when you're doing this, one of the things you've got to do is introduce Moriarty. He doesn't have quite the prominence that Holmes does. You can presume that if the movie says The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, people are going to go to the cinema and expect to see a fellow who looks like Sherlock Holmes. So you have to introduce Moriarty. But part of the problem with the way that the story worked is you take out a lot of suspense with that early challenge. And so you don't have Holmes, I don't think, effectively trying to figure out what all of these details and strange events really mean. And I think it's a less successful picture than Hound.
Yeah, and it seemed, at least to not only some reviewers, but even some of the actors at the time, that this plot, or at least the script, was just too padded. It went on for too long and wound in different ways that didn't really propel the action forward as urgently as it might otherwise have done. And you've got interludes too. The comic relief of Holmes plucking on his violin throughout the thing. We'll get to the denouement of that in a bit. But of course, there was the musical interlude with Rathbone in disguise singing that old favorite, "I Do Like to Be Beside the Seaside."
And I do like to be beside the seaside. I do like to be beside the sea. I do like to stroll along the prom, where the brass band plays tickety-yom-bom. So just let me be beside the seaside. I'll be beside myself with glee. For there's lots of girls beside. I should like to be beside the seaside, beside the sea.
One of the funniest reminders of that was a couple of years ago at the Baker Street Irregulars weekend. The Baker Street Babes had their annual gala, and the theme was the beach. And they encouraged people to show up in appropriate Victorian beach attire. Well, good old Tim Greer, one of our listeners, and he was with us here on the show recently. Tim Greer showed up as Basil Rathbone in that getup from I Do Like to Be Beside the Seaside. The striped blazer and the straw boater and even the false nose and mustache. It was pretty creative and funny.
Oh, it's a hoot. It's a lovely moment in the picture. It's one of the most creative things about one of Sherlock Holmes's disguises that you could imagine. And it gave Rathbone an opportunity to sing and dance. My goodness, how he must have enjoyed it.
Yeah.
But, even Nigel Bruce in his autobiography, there's an unpublished autobiography of Nigel Bruce that you can find online, observed that we took 5.5 weeks to make a rather rambling and complicated story which had no resemblance to any of the writings of Conan Doyle.
It's very interesting from an actor playing a Watson eventually that had no resemblance to the Watson of the books. But I do like a couple of points about this film. One is that they clearly had fun on the set. Ida Lupino was really her first dramatic part, but she had fun on the set because she called Rathbone by her pet name, which was Basil Bathrug. There's no record as to how he took to that, but was very very interesting. So, you know what? My mistake. My mistake. We thought Lionel Atwill was Professor Moriarty. He was not.
Oh, right. No. Did we say that? Right. We did. Did we say it was Atwill?
We started with him, yeah, but because he appeared in a later version, but he was replaced at the last minute by George Zucco. One take Zucco. So, our apologies for that. That's who you heard in that clip. It was not Lionel Atwill, but George Zucco.
Oh, right.
But the other thing was in terms of the fun that the folks had here. We as viewers were treated to some of that fun as well, and the ending to really tie up all the loose ends was changed to a brief restaurant scene where you've got Holmes once again plucking away on his violin, and Watson really stepping in to save the day for not only for Holmes but for all of us as well.
Those flies again.
Very effective, my dear Watson.
Elementary, my dear Holmes. Elementary.
There we go. That's almost reminiscent of Christopher Plummer squashing the pea for James Mason.
You squashed my pea.
The roles were reversed. Well, at that point, there's a bit of a hiatus here with Holmes and Watson. This of course was toward the end of 1939 that the film was released. I think in September 1st is when it was released into the cinemas. But then by the time October rolled around, you've got a slightly different appearance by Rathbone and Bruce as Holmes and Watson. They decided, well, through their agents, I'm sure, that they would suddenly take to radio. Starting on October 2nd, 1939, both, Rathbone and Bruce would appear every Monday night on NBC from 8:30 to 9. And we've got a wonderful dramatization of the stories done by none other than Edith Meiser. And she was admired by both Rathbone and Bruce. And her husband, Tom McKnight, directed the series. He was a Sherlock Holmes enthusiast.
This episode from the life of Sherlock Holmes will be transmitted to our men and women overseas by shortwave and through the worldwide facilities of the Armed Forces Radio Service. Petri Wine brings you Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce in the new adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The Petri family, the family that took time to bring you good wine, invite you to listen to Dr. Watson tell us another exciting adventure he shared with his old friend, that master detective, Sherlock Holmes.
I don't know if the Petri family took quite enough time.
But, it was such a charming setup for those stories. The idea, the concept was, of course, that Watson had retired to a rambling redwood ranch house in California in the United States for some reason, with, I think, puppies and dogs or something like that. So we would encounter Watson in on the Pacific coast, sitting before a raging fire, tending to his dogs, puffing on his pipe and quaffing whole quarts of Petri wine or sherry or Petri port.
Young fellow, my lad. I used to call Mr. Bart, Mr. Bartell, yes, young fellow, my lad. But yeah, it was a formula that worked for quite some time. This series went on for I think a couple of years, and then was resurrected in the mid 40s once again. So it was probably 1942 before we got back to Holmes and Watson on the screen. The war began after the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th, 1941. And the Conan Doyle estate and 20th Century Fox were in protracted negotiations. And as one might expect when the Conan Doyle sons are involved, the negotiations broke down between Dennis and Adrian.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is that, Rathbone, up until the time he was cast as Sherlock Holmes, had been playing movie villains, and he was a little concerned about being typecast. And so he plays Holmes twice. Well, and this is an actor who, for his career, was so concerned about being typecast and who felt he was typecast by Holmes. So when the two 20th Century Fox pictures end, what does he do? He becomes a villain in the Mark of Zorro.
Yes.
And Nigel Bruce, oddly enough, makes a couple of pictures with Alfred Hitchcock in Rebecca and Suspicion. So it's interesting how versatile, for all of the typecasting, the way Bruce himself was typed as Boobus Britannicus, it's interesting how many parts he got to play and what his experience was with directors like Hitchcock.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember seeing him in, I think, what was it, Suspicion? As Cary Grant's friend. So you've got this interlude here of a couple of years, and Fox, 20th Century Fox, wanted to move away from the traditional, and of course the war was on everyone's minds, and spies and foreign agents and spies were much more typical and topical than the antiquated criminal activities of Professor Moriarty and the like. According to the executives at Fox. So what ended up happening is with 20th Century Fox no longer being in official negotiations with the Conan Doyle family, Universal Studios stepped up. And they decided that they would do the unthinkable. They would transport Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson to present day, to 1942.
Yeah. And it's worth pointing out that detective films at that time were a big deal, and Universal was the only studio that didn't have a series. So 20th Century Fox had Charlie Chan, they had Mr. Moto, played by Peter Lorre. Yes. MGM had The Thin Man, which went on for over a decade. Warner Brothers had a series. Philo Vance was at Paramount, but Universal didn't have the detective, and so voila.
Yeah. But when you think about this, it was not some, outre thing that Universal did by bringing Holmes to present day. No. When you look at The Hound of the Baskervilles and The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, those were actually the first films of Holmes that were done in Victorian times.
Right.
All of the other films until then were filmed as modern-day adaptations.
Right.
Eileen Norwood, Clive Brook, John Barrymore, those all played Sherlock Holmes in present-day London.
Well, Conan Doyle, the last series of stories, of course, was published in 1927. So from 1890 to 1927, so that's almost 40 years, Holmes was a constant figure in publication, and therefore always viewed as contemporary. So even when Raymond Massey did The Speckled Band in the 1930s, he was shown in modern dress in this sort of bizarre detective agency with lots of secretaries and dictagraphs. And you're absolutely right. Rathbone was the first to take Holmes back to Victorian garb.
Yeah. So you've got this deal that Universal did with the Conan Doyle estate, with the brothers. It was a 7-year deal, $300,000, and it included the rights to 21 stories from the canon. And the only stipulation therein was that Universal had to make 3 movies a year, and at least 2 of which had to be adaptations of the original stories. So it was obviously a creative writing effort for the writing staff there. They had to be a little inventive in terms of how they adapted, and it's very clear, as you'll see in some of these films, which stories came into play based on the plots. But Rathbone and Bruce got a long-term contract out of this as well. They had, $850 a week for 40 weeks a year, and then a raise of $100 a week at the end of each year. So, especially for Bruce, who appreciated steady work, this was a good deal. So then we move into February of 1942, when Sherlock Holmes and the Voice of Terror kicked off. This was directed by John Rawlins and was based loosely on His Last Bow. But this is, of course, the infamous debut of the Basil Rathbone do. Or don't, as some may put it. Bad hair Basil with that look as if he stood backwards in a wind tunnel and was impersonating Julius Caesar or something. But you've got Holmes in pursuit of the Nazis, who are spreading propaganda on the radio through something that is known as the Voice of Terror.
Are you ready, Operative Number 7? This is the Voice of Terror. A secret airplane factory somewhere in England. Listen, the screams of the dying can still be heard. This is the Voice of Terror. Are you there, people of Britain, shivering in your cellars? Listen, Operative 41. The fuse is lighted. Oil to fuel your navy, to feed your tanks. There it goes up in smoke by the millions of gallons. This is the Voice of Terror. Do you still believe that there are secrets unknown to the Fuhrer? Listen.
I have to say, that's an interesting accent. I can't quite make out whether it's English, German, or Japanese. A little bit of everything in that one.
Yeah, and of course it was based on the real-life exploits of Lord Haw Haw, who was really a small group of English-speaking announcers who broadcast from Germany, who broadcast into the United Kingdom via medium wave and then by short wave around the world into the United States. And one of those was a fellow named William Joyce, who was an American Irishman who became a German citizen who began every one of his broadcasts with the distinctive announcement, "Germany calling, Germany calling." And so this was very relevant. People would know, would relate this to something. Well, so they had the bombing raids and the motor cars and the gunfights, and they're very different from the Hound of the Baskervilles and the adventures of Sherlock Holmes.
It is very different, but when you think about the realistic nature of the Sherlock Holmes stories in the Strand magazine as they appeared, and people writing to Baker Street thinking that Sherlock Holmes was a real individual, this was an extension of that. And look, this is no, you think about radio itself. Remember, it was in 1938 that Orson Welles ran War of the Worlds, and that was so realistic, in fact, that people actually believed that it was happening. So this notion of art imitating life, I think, was a running theme.
Yeah, and in his unpublished autobiography, Nigel Bruce observed that Basil and I were much opposed to the modernizing of these stories, but the producer pointed out to us that the majority of the youngsters who would see our pictures were accustomed to the fast-moving action of gangster pictures, and that expecting machine guns, police sirens, cars traveling at 80 miles an hour, and dialogue like, "Put 'em up, bud."
How do you do, sir? I suppose I should say, how are you, buddy? What's cooking?
Oh, come along, Watson.
Oh, it says in the book. What's cooking?
What's cooking? Yes. Oh my goodness!
Oh, that's wonderful, and that's from Washington, right? Sherlock Holmes in Washington.
No, that was this one. That was
really?
Voice of Terror. Yeah. What's cooking, buddy?
Oh, that's right. He meets an American.
Oh.
And he tries to speak American to him.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we get to more of the gum chewing and whatnot in Sherlock Holmes in Washington.
Yeah. Well, this is where the character of Watson really changed. You know, and I think that was because they felt the need to introduce a little light relief.
Yeah.
And Nigel Bruce, in his autobiography, said, as I played him, the Doctor was a complete stooge. for his brilliant friend, and one whose intelligence was almost negligible. Many of the lovers of Conan Doyle must have been shocked not only by this caricature of the famous doctor, but by seeing the great detective alighting from an aeroplane and the good doctor listening to his radio.
Yeah. I mean, even Lauren Usselman later on observed that, if a mop bucket appeared in a scene, his foot would be inside it. And if by some sardonic twist of fate he managed to stumble upon an important clue, he could be depended upon to blow his nose on it and throw it away. Yeah, this is really where we see the origin of Watson as boobus Britannicus, unfortunately. Well, our friend Jerry Kegley is... Oh,
Jerry Kegley.
Yeah, he's just a staunch defender of Nigel Bruce as Watson. And I don't think Jerry buys into the boobus Britannicus claim. So.
Oh no! Well, I'm a great fan of Nigel Bruce too. It's important to note that Nigel Bruce didn't get up one morning and say to himself, I think this is what I'm going to do. I mean,
no,
the idea of providing a little comic relief to the story, was something that was suggested to him.
Of course, and of course he didn't get up and say that. He got up and said, "What was that again?"
He got up and said, my check is here. Very good.
No, you're absolutely right. This was a deliberate move by the creators, the entire team. It was not a Nigel Bruce decision. But Rathbone himself understood the importance of having his colleague and friend Nigel Bruce playing Watson. He said, "There's no question in my mind that Nigel Bruce was the ideal Dr. Watson, not only of his time, but of possibly of and for all time. There was an endearing quality to his performance that, to a very large extent, I believe, humanized the relationship between Dr. Watson and Mr. Holmes. It has always seemed to me to be more possible that our adventures might have met with a less kindly public acceptance had they been recorded by a less lovable companion to Holmes than was Nigel's Dr. Watson, and a less engaging friend to me than was Willie Bruce."
Well, that's, the one word really that stands out in that to me is lovable. Nigel Bruce's Watson really was lovable, and I think that came through to the audience.
Yes, indeed. But someone who was not lovable in that film was our friend Henry Daniell. The waspish, suspicious member of the British intelligence. And he, of course, will appear later in the series as, I think, one of the definitive Moriartys in this series. Henry Daniell. And of course we also had the debut of another series regular, Harry Cording. He played, I think, 8 roles in the Universal series. And he was Camberwell. Of course you'll remember Camberwell the Poisoner. He was the ex-prisoner who confronts Holmes in a bar in Limehouse. So then we've got to wait another 5 months before we get to Sherlock Holmes and the Secret Weapon, which again was in the war-torn London, based on the Adventure of the Dancing Men, and you've got notably here a few firsts. We've got the first time that we see Dennis Hoey as Inspector Lestrade. And you've got, why don't we pause for a moment and honor the memory of Lestrade.
Told you it was a lot of nonsense. I don't understand. That thing was way a ton. Look at those men staggering. You've hit on something, Doctor. A few tools wouldn't take that much energy. We've just looked inside. On the top only, there might be a false bottom. Hey, you stop there! Stop or I'll shoot! Holmes. Well, I'll be blowed. You're not hurt?
No. Well, you needn't have yelled at them so abruptly.
Huh?
They dropped me on my head.
Oh.
Moriarty would have been delighted.
So there we are. Hoey would go on to star in a number of, or join them in a number of other movies. And this is where we see the return of Lionel Atwill. He played Moriarty in this version after getting dropped from the adventures in favor of George Zucco. But more importantly, I think this is the start of another collaboration, and that is with the director, Roy William Neill.
Oh, yes, indeed. And we noted back in IHO's episode 36, I think it was, where we first used a little clip of this, that Neill's entry into this series was a major event. He really had a huge effect on the staging, the characterization, the production. Neill really defined the rest of these pictures. And, it's worth pointing out this is the second in a series of 12 that happened at Universal. So the first one was Voice of Terror. And so from now on, they'll be directed by Roy William Neill. And some years ago, Rathbone, in a rare talk, recounted the experience of this production and the influence of Roy William Neill.
There was a little man called Roy Neill. He was a comparatively unknown director, but he had great devotion to the stories. And he was the producer, director, and writer, with a man who helped out in the writing called Mulhauser. These scripts were prepared so that 1 month before we were to appear on the set, we were called down, we were sent the scripts. There was Dennis Hoey, who played Lestrade, there was Nigel Bruce, Watson, myself, and whomever the leading woman, or perhaps one other important character. If it was Moriarty, it would be Lionel Atwill, or Henry Daniel, or George Zucco, wasn't that his name? Zucco, yeah. We would meet, and we would read through the scripts, and Roy would say, now, if you fellows want to make any comments, this is the time, because from here in, this story goes into production, and on Monday, April the 9th, we shall start shooting at 9 o'clock. Well, if there were comments to be made, if there was anything which bothered any of us, we spoke at that time. None of those pictures made at Universal took more than 17 days. We never started shooting before 9, which is the normal time. Today it's 8:30 or even 8 o'clock. 9 o'clock until 6. No night work unless it was so specified that it called for night work. 4 o'clock was half an hour for tea. And this was this mood of the whole of the making of these pictures. They had a sense of family. We all got along very well together. We had our little differences from time to time. But the one lovely character of them all was our dear friend Roy Neill, the director. They were 12 very special experiences.
That's a wonderful recording. We should probably note that was made on a visit with the Maiwand Jezzails in Wayne, Nebraska in November of 1965. So that would have been just about 2 years before Rathbone passed away. He was very hesitant usually to join Sherlockian societies for meetings, never accepted an invitation to attend the Baker Street Irregulars dinner. But he did manage to make it to this group in Nebraska, of all places, and gave that wonderful talk. Yeah.
Yeah, it's lovely to hear his perspective. He's slightly shocked, I hear, at the idea of starting at 8. Oh, 8:30, 8 o'clock. Yeah. I mean, what he would have to say about today's film production.
Oh, please.
Would drive him crazy. And then at 4 o'clock they broke for tea, and they took 17 days. Well, my goodness, you could tell. And they got paid a princely sum.
Yes.
You could tell why particularly Nigel Bruce, was so fond of having this continue as long as possible.
And the fond memories of George Zuckow.
Zuckow, is that his name?
Yeah. Zuckow as Moriarty.
Now, Holmes, what should it be? The gas chamber, the cup of hemlock, or just a simple bullet through your brain?
You disappoint me, Professor.
Indeed?
Yes. Somehow I always thought that in the end you'd prove to be just an ordinary cutthroat.
Now, that, of course, is Lionel Atwill from this time around in The Secret of Sherlock Holmes. So, well, anyway,
no, it's not The Secret of Sherlock Holmes. It's Sherlock Holmes and the Secret Weapon.
Secret Weapon, yes. I don't know why I keep doing that.
Well, I think that was their original title, wasn't it, or something like that? Oh, no, it was supposed to have been called Sherlock Holmes Fights Back.
Fights Back, yes. Well, so let's keep moving along here now that we've got Roy William Neal on board. He kept them going at a pretty quick pace. Let's do the same. Originally titled Sherlock Holmes in the USA, we, of course, have Sherlock Holmes in Washington, which this was Universal's original story. You've got a British secret agent who's assigned the task of smuggling out an important document that, of course, is vital to the war effort. And he wants to get it to the authorities in Washington. He's shrunken this message into a microfilm, and the microfilm is encased in a match folder. So this of course is where we see Henry Daniel join us once again as a kind of a smarmy yet suave henchman called Mr. Easter. So we're delighted to be graced with his presence once again.
But the villain, Hinkle, is played by George Zuckow, so he is I think he's an antique dealer or something like that.
Yes.
In his picture, and this would be the last time that he turns up in a Holmes picture. He was, of course, Moriarty in The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, and here he is as the evil Heinrich Hinkle. Boy, I wonder what would give him away with a name like Heinrich Hinkle. In 1943.
Yeah. Well, and just to have it summed up accurately, let's turn to Holmes himself.
Just as I thought. This document has been reduced to microfilm to make its concealment possible. Alfred Pettibone is a most ingenious fellow. A bulky document is obviously difficult to conceal. But 2 pages of estate paper, photographed on microfilm, would be reduced to a size no larger than a halfpenny stamp. Slitting a match folder with this razor blade, Pettibone placed the now minute document inside, stuck it together again, and there he had it. An American match folder, rare in London, but completely inconspicuous in the United States.
Do you mean to say we're off to America just to look for a match folder? It's a big country.
A big country, Watson. And a small match folder. Come along.
Now, oddly enough, the plan was that they would have Mycroft in this picture, which is a great loss for me. So Mycroft never appeared, and the idea of having Mycroft in it was, never followed up on. And the idea was that Mycroft would be the one who would be getting Holmes involved in this case at the beginning of the picture. But the casting was supposed to be Oscar Homolka, who, if you Google search Oscar Homolka and see his photograph, I mean, he's a fine actor. He's an Austrian. He was in one of Hitchcock's pictures. But it certainly wasn't my particular conception of Mycroft. So probably it's not a great tragedy.
Yeah, which we didn't get any kind of any kind of portrayal of Mycroft at all in the rest of the series, which is unfortunate when you think about it.
Yeah.
I think Robert Morley was alive at the time, and I don't know if he ever played Mycroft in a film, but he would have made the type of, had the type of profile of an actor that could have been entirely appropriate as a Mycroft. So, But anyway, I just love the name Oscar Homolka. There was an old George Carlin routine where he was talking about some beach blanket bingo type movie. He said starring Sandra Dee, Bobby V, and Oscar Homolka. Would have been quite a film. Well, on to the next couple of Holmes films. We're moving away from the Nazis.
I just remembered something.
What's that?
Morley did play Mycroft, I think, with, what's his name? With John Neville.
Oh, you're right.
In Study in Terror.
Study in Terror? 66, 67? What was that?
Yeah, it was in the 60s.
65.
Because I just had this image of that
65.
particular scene.
Yes.
And I was trying to remember, because Morley did so much, and I remember Morley from, a lot of his detective and comic detective pictures, but I'm pretty sure he was Mycroft with John Neville.
I think that is the one. That is the one, because it was a set piece. It was done in the actual time. And it was Holmes versus Jack the Ripper, I believe.
The Ripper,
yeah. That Morley was in that one. So, perfect. Well, we are on to the next Holmes film. In 1943, I guess Neil, at this point, had tired of the Nazis, so it was on to Sherlock Holmes Faces Death. This, of course, was an adaptation of the Musgrave Ritual. An interesting take on it. It was not quite the same. It didn't have the same meter as the Musgrave Ritual, but we'll let you hear it.
Who first shall find it were better dead. Who next shall find it perils his head. The last to find it defies dark powers and brings good fortune to Hurlstone Towers. Where was the light? On the face of the messenger. Where did he speed? To guard the Queen's page.
See, anytime you can have thunder and lightning effects wrapped in, it really adds to it.
Oh, it's great. This is one of the great classic pictures. I mean, it's not really Sherlock Holmes, but it's such a wonderful example of those universal pictures. You've got secret passageways, an old castle. You've got the Musgrave Ritual, which plays out as a chess game, which is a little bizarre even as a chess game. You've got people like Hilary Brooke, who we were just listening to, who went on to be sort of the comic foil for Abbott and Costello years later. And you've got Milburn's, you've got Watson is taking care of all of these shell-shocked veterans from the war in Musgrave Manor. And you've got Milburn Stone there, who went on to a great role in the television series Gunsmoke in the United States. And he was a very short actor. And I think everybody they cast was taller than Milburn Stone, so one wonders why they cast him in the first place.
Yeah.
But even in Rathbone, who was not particularly a tall man, there was one scene where he had to walk across the floor or something with Milburn Stone, and so Rathbone walked on the floor, and Milburn Stone walked on a little stage that they had put up, that sort of elevated him by a foot.
That's wonderful. Well, and of course, this is the first time we are treated to Sherlock Holmes in the Universal series without that windswept hairdo.
Yes.
It is back to the old swept back style. But largely Sherlock Holmes Faces Death is regarded as one of the better films in the series. And if you're going to start anywhere in the Universal series, if you want to skip over the war-torn Sherlock Holmes versus the Nazis, this is a fine piece to start with, a fine movie, because it's just that classic genre of, partially the Hollywood 1940s horror films, because you've got aspects of the sets in there. It's that locked room mystery. It's, the chessboard. It's the Musgrave Ritual tied in. It's got a lot of great elements that make it a lot of fun.
Yeah, and we should point out that they made these in tranches. So the first three pictures they made together. So it's not, as Rathbone said in his discussion, they get together for 17 days and then say goodbye. So they did Voice of Terror, Secret Weapon, and Sherlock Holmes in Washington in one go. And then Faces Death and Spiderwoman, which we're about to talk about in the second go.
But before we get to the Spiderwoman, we want to have a little bit of fun regarding death ourselves. we do have a new sponsor for this show. Sherlock Holmes and the Cryptic Clues, A Grave Undertaking. This is a book by Michael W. McClure, who is a fellow member of the Baker Street Irregulars. And I have to say, there really isn't another book like this on the market. It is Michael's investiture in the Baker Street Irregulars is Stimson and Company. Now, Bert, do you know the significance of Stimson and Company?
Oh, they were always digging for the truth. They were digging for something, I think, weren't they?
Yes, they are the only funeral service mentioned in the entire canon. And Michael formed a Scion Society of the BSI in 1990 called Stimson Company. And these are for people that work in the funeral business who are also Sherlockians. So, you talk about niche. That not only is that group niche, but this book is targeted at people who have gallows humor. If you've ever visited Disney World, the Magic Kingdom, or Disneyland, and have gone through the ride, the Haunted Mansion, you wait in line there, and there are some pretty amusing tombstones that await you. And basically what you've got with this book is a graveyard that is honoring about 300 Sherlockians. It's all invested irregulars and ash. And their faces are featured on various tombstones and grave sites, along with a name of a character from the canon. Now, the only trick is the name that appears on the tombstone does not necessarily align with that person's investiture. So it's a bit of a treasure hunt, So we talk about the gamesmanship and the treasure hunt in Sherlock Holmes Faces Death. Not really that dissimilar here in Sherlock Holmes and the Cryptic Clues. And
it is a terrific book, and I have to tell you that although I've had it for a couple of weeks, I am dying to get into it.
Yeah. Well, you can enjoy some headlines or some tombstones like, "Here lie the remains of Franklin the Crank. For the peace we enjoy, we have God to thank." John Clayton's fame was quite vast. He'd drive his cab very fast, claiming, "I am renowned for covering ground. The ground covered him at the last." Oh, rest in Pete.
Well, surely that happens if you're buried in Scotland.
Oh, don't call me Shirley. Well, if you would like to get the final word in Sherlockian scholarship, go ahead and get on over to BaskervilleProductions.com and check under the books section there. You can buy it in paperback or hardcover. It's poignant. It's punny. It is everything you would want in gallows humor and Sherlockians. So Bert and I are thrilled to be included in this tome, and we are thrilled to have Sherlock Holmes and the Cryptic Clues as part of our sponsorship lineup. Yeah. Well, back to Rathbone and Bruce. We were crawling over to the Spiderwoman, as I recall.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So this is another one that involves some of the original stories, or was based on some of the original stories.
Well, kind of, yeah.
Yeah. Well,
it starts with a tip of the fishing cap to
that's true.
to the final problem in which Holmes appears to be dead, but unlike the noble battle with Professor Moriarty at the Reichenbach, Holmes mentions to Watson that he's got some strange symptoms, which in about 20 seconds, Watson's keen diagnostic gifts apparently lead him to quickly conclude that Holmes has just, minutes to live. And so, of course, they do what you and I would do. They go fishing. And amazingly, Holmes, while he's out there in the pond or in the river, falls in, and the world is aghast to learn that Sherlock Holmes is dead.
Go figure. Well, not for long.
No.
As we're about to hear, Holmes does, in fact, find Lestrade and gets on the case.
The instrument of death was a spider, there's no doubt about it, Lestrade. And the bite of the creature drove these pajama suicides to kill themselves.
How did he get into your room?
Through this ventilator.
Now, don't tell me that there spider had your name and address in his pocket.
Hardly. This screen was removed from the mouth of the ventilator, obviously to admit something much larger than a spider. We know only half of the machinery of these crimes.
The ventilator and an animal crawling through it. Where do they get that from?
Oh, it sounds a bit like the Speckled Band.
Yes. Well, it was a lot of fun, and you've got Gail Sondergaard, who joined them this time around for this wonderful. She really was a wonderful villain, really kind of standing in the place of Moriarty as a villainous foil.
Yeah. Oh, it was wonderful. Yeah, really wonderful. The terrible Adria Spedding, the Spiderwoman, and she became so popular. At least the character name and Gail Sondergaard became so popular that there was another picture, I think, in which she played the Spiderwoman.
Yeah,
in 1944, along with Rondo Hatton, who we're about to find in another picture.
Yes, yeah. So that was a fun outing. Then, of course, we went on to Sherlock Holmes and the Scarlet Claw. And just as a reminder, we are still in 1944 here. And happening also concurrently in the Sherlockian world. I think 44 was when the trilogy dinner happened. That was the extra Baker Street Irregulars function that year, March of 1944, was called the Trilogy Dinner because 3 books were published and handed out at that dinner. Those books were The Misadventures of Sherlock Holmes by Ellery Queen. And let's see, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, a textbook in friendship by good old Christopher Morley. And I believe the third was Profile in Gaslight by Edgar Smith. So just some remarkable books in the Sherlockian trove at the time while these films were being put out. So Spiderwoman, followed by now Scarlet Claw.
Oh, and the Scarlet Claw is one of my favorites. It's got to be my favorite top 1 or 2 of the Rathbone Universal pictures because this is a picture that borrows sort of atmospherically from the Hound of the Baskervilles. So you have this creepy fog-ridden area. You're up in Canada in a remote village called La Mort Rouge, which so when you have your letterheads imprinted the Red Death, you know something is wrong. Oh, where do you live, David? Oh, it's a charming town called La Mort Rouge. I don't know about that. Michael McClure might like that, though.
Yes.
And there's some strange beast cutting out the throats of its victims. And Holmes' client, sadly, is Lady Penrose, who unfortunately dies ringing the church bell for help.
No, and once again in this film we're greeted by Gerald Hamer.
Oh boy.
Yeah. So a lot of fun there.
He's a lucky guy. He got to play some really unique roles as part of the stock company here.
Yes. Yeah. Well done. And on to the next entry in the series, Sherlock Holmes and the Pearl of Death. Which came out in September of 1944. Now, of course, we've heard of a Black Pearl of the Borgias in the original stories in The Adventure of the Six Napoleons. And now you've got the same kind of thing happening. Holmes stopping the theft of the Borgia Pearl by a thief who's in the employment of a master criminal.
Your fingers have now closed on a matter of £50,000.
What? Can't be real.
Real as death, old fellow. The blood of 20 men upon it, down through the centuries.
Where'd you get it?
From a charming young lady named Drake. Elias Yvette de Joux, alias Lisa Vanini.
Never heard of her.
No, nor of Giles Conover either, I fancy.
Well, I can't say that I have.
That's the incredible thing about it, Watson. This man pervades Europe like a plague. Yet no one has heard of him. That's what puts him on the pinnacle in the records of crime.
What'd he do?
Everything and nothing. In his whole diabolical career, the police have never been able to pin anything on him. And yet, show me crime without motive, robbery without a clue, murder without a trace, and I'll show you...
Professor Moriarty.
No, Giles Conover.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that as their plot devices, whether it's the Spiderwoman or Miles Conover, that it's always a Moriarty stand-in, some kind of mastermind who's pulling the strings behind everything. I think they found a formula and they ran with it. They just changed the plots, changed the name from time to time.
Well, it works. You've got a superhero, as you have pointed out, as we've pointed out in the past in Holmes, and he needs a worthy opponent.
That is true. And, worthy opponents also come with henchmen. You mentioned henchmen. In this case, it was the Creeper. Ooh. The Creeper, played by Rondo Hatton, who had acromegaly, so he looked even creepier than a creeper might normally look. And he actually went on to have his own series of films as the Creeper, joining Dracula, Frankenstein, the Phantom, in the Universal Hall of Monsters, as it were, before he died prematurely in 1946.
Yeah, so sad. He was a sports writer who'd grown up in Florida, and he had been voted the handsomest boy in his class.
Wow.
At high school in Tampa, Florida. And then at 20, he developed this disease, which is a disorder of the pituitary gland. And he did manage to have quite a career, a short-lived career, as you say, in films.
Yeah. Well, we move on from horror to fear as the House of Fear was released in 1945. And this one was based on the 5 Orange Pips. This marks Nigel Bruce's 50th film in Hollywood. And, of course, we've got The Good Comrades, which is a group of men living remotely in a Scottish manse named Drearcliff House. And they're being murdered. They're being picked off one by one. And they're tipped off as to who's going to be killed next by the receipt of an envelope containing 5 Orange Pips.
The events I'm about to relate began a fortnight ago, in a grim old house perched high on a cliff on the west coast of Scotland. This singular structure is known as Drearcliff House. Gathered there for dinner were the 7 members of a most extraordinary club called the Good Comrades.
Good Comrade. Isn't that what they call the White House administration?
Yeah. All for one and one for the exits.
I kid. But yeah, again, this gothic horror type filled film that really seemed to be doing the trick in the mid-40s at Universal. And it was double billed. It was released as a double bill with The Mummy's Curse, which, when you think about it, is pretty interesting because The Mummy had its origins with a Conan Doyle story. Years prior, Lot 249.
Yes, that's right.
So, but a lot of fun there. So then we move on to the 11th outing. Remember, there are only 14 films here, folks. We're at 11, so, if you need to pause and use the restroom, now you go right ahead. We'll understand. But we'll keep going. There will be no intermission here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. But this brings us to The Woman in Green.
Good one.
Yeah. So we've experienced elements of The Empty House, or The Final Problem in an earlier film. This has elements of The Empty House thrown in. And this, of course, is that film where Watson is famously hypnotized. And we, of course, see the return of none other than Professor Moriarty, this time by our friend Henry Daniell.
Oh, yeah. The best.
He was. He's been described as a Moriarty who is weary and suave, and almost as if he couldn't be bothered by this evil doing business. But he had the power to electrify those in his presence just by a mere glance. And Rathbone himself, in his autobiography, said there were other Moriartys, but none so delectably dangerous as that of Henry Daniell.
And there's one lovely thing that happens here. Of course, this particular picture draws from The Adventure of the Empty House, and it also draws from the Ripper murders, because the whole premise here is that women are being murdered, and each one, bizarrely, is having a finger removed. But the last thing it draws from is the meeting between Moriarty and Holmes, which is how we first have this great scene with Henry Daniell.
Oh, Professor Moriarty. Not that I wish to appear inquisitive, but to what am I indebted for the pleasure of this visit? Scotland Yard will be interested.
It's very convenient for me to have Scotland Yard think that I'm still dead in Montevideo. I never dreamed of fooling you.
Thank you.
The thought occurs to me, Mr. Holmes, that there are some advantages in living within the law. You're very comfortably fixed here, aren't you? As I get on in life, the little comforts appeal to me more and more.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Won't you sit down?
Thank you.
And now, Professor Moriarty, what can I do for you?
Everything that I have to say to you has already crossed your mind.
My answer has no doubt crossed yours.
That's final?
What do you think? I shall not rest until you are hanged for the finger murders.
You've no proof, you know.
No, not a shred. But I have you. I could turn you over to the police here and now.
You could. If you did, you'd never see Dr. Watson again.
Oh, the telephone call.
Quite.
I rather assumed you had taken some such precaution. Or I should have snatched up a revolver and indulged in a fit of heroics when you came in.
Very smart, aren't you?
Not smart enough, or I should have anticipated you. But if any harm comes to Dr. Watson, I shall seek you out. I shall not rest until I find you, and when I do...
No harm will come to Dr. Watson this time. But I can't answer for the future. Mr. Holmes, I should strongly advise you to drop this case.
Don't be silly.
Think it over. We've had many encounters in the past. You hope to place me on the gallows. I tell you I shall never stand up on the gallows. But if you are instrumental in any way in bringing about my destruction, you will not be alive to enjoy your satisfaction.
And we shall walk together through the gates of eternity, hand in hand.
What a charming picture that would make.
Yes, wouldn't it? I really think it might be worth it.
Just the playoff between the two. Even though it was updated for the movie here, it's that classic scene between Holmes and Moriarty where you've got these two brains, the meeting of the minds, as it were. It's wonderful to see it, and played so well by both Rathbone and Daniell. So, well, we move into the fall of 1945, and we find Rathbone and Bruce preparing for the 5th season of their radio show, The New Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, and then by the end of October, we've got the 12th in their movie series together. It's Pursuit to Algiers, where they're preparing for a holiday on Scotland, and they get on board a ship, obviously bound for Algiers. So I'm not as familiar with this one as I am with some of the others, Bert. I can't say that this was one of the ones that has ranked high in very many folks' estimation.
Well, no, but there's some charming things in it. The basic idea here is that there's a very mysterious opening where they're sort of directed to this fish and chip shop or this pub, and they find out that they've got to intercede to protect the king of some small European country, and then they wind up on the ship, but it's not, Holmes hasn't made the ship, and Watson hears that Holmes's plane has crashed. So he's deeply, deeply discouraged. And then it turns out, that the king is really on board, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a couple of lovely things here. One is where there's a scene with Nigel Bruce at one of the dinners in the ship where he's attempting to recount the case of the giant rat of Sumatra. And he starts by explaining a bit of action using, I think, a stick of celery as Holmes and a salt shaker as himself. And this whole scene goes on, nothing happens. They come to a brick wall and he's got to move the celery and the salt shaker back. And there's another lovely scene where he gets to sing, which I think is really Nigel Bruce's voice. He gets to sing Flow Gently, Sweet Afton. But in terms of great dramatic moments and things that are really central to Sherlock Holmes, I think it's safe to say there aren't very many here at all.
Yeah, and I would side with our friend and fellow Baker Street irregular David Stewart Davies, who in Holmes of the Movies said, Pursuit to Algiers showed a decided decline in inventiveness and proved to be the weakest of the series. So, we'll see. But then we are on to another one that finds our heroes trapped aboard a transportation vessel, this time not a ship, but a train, and that is Terror by Night. Where they're on the Scottish Express, and the Star of Rhodesia, priceless diamond, has been stolen from one of the passengers. And the villain, of course, we've moved on from Moriarty as Henry Daniell fell to his death in the previous film, or two films previous in
Woman in Green.
Woman in Green, that's right. And instead we have Colonel Sebastian Moran making an appearance here.
And his air gun.
That is true. His air pistol.
His air pistol here, yeah.
It was
with the great prop air guns. Apparently with just a couple of squeezes on the plunger, you can kill somebody pretty easily.
It's like my kid's Nerf gun in that case.
Yeah, it looks like a squirt gun.
Yeah. So, but, it was a fun story. Again, a good train mystery for those of you who like Murder on the Orient Express and the like.
Well, you've got Sebastian Moran, you've got an air pistol, and you also have sort of a tip of the hat to Lady Frances Carfax in that somebody is concealed in a coffin. But there you are. Yeah. And you've got a lovely little comic bit by Dennis Hoey. And
of course.
Gerald Hamer is in here as another little wonderful comic bit is somebody who's absconded from a hotel with a teapot.
Yeah, I remember that. Scotland Yard is on our case, yes.
That's right, I'll go quietly. Yeah.
Indeed. So at this point, this is in 1946, Universal said to Rathbone, we have more plans for the series. We'd like to shoot 4 more films throughout 46. Right, so that was kind of upping the cadence that the Conan Doyle brothers expected. And again, Rathbone was thinking about the typecasting, and at that point he just decided, you know what, I'm out. I can't do it anymore. And that in that case, it meant that there was only one more film that Rathbone and Bruce and Roy William Neill would make together as Holmes and Watson and their director. And that film, of course, is
Dressed to Kill.
Originally entitled Prelude to Murder.
And it's a lovely picture because, there are a lot of things to enjoy here. It's got the device of the music boxes.
Yes.
So that the secret message has been divided across a series of musical boxes. And you have that lovely little tune. But you also have the beautiful Patricia Morrison, who turns up in the role of Hilda Courtney. So she is the Spiderwoman or the Moriarty character in this particular picture. And she's the chief villainess here, and she does a lovely job. She appears in disguise in different characters. She must have had a grand time doing.
Yeah. And do you know Patricia Morrison, as of this recording, is still with us? She's still alive? She's 100
years old.
100 years old now. Yeah. And can you believe it? I could not get her to come on the show.
Well, I think she's skiing, isn't she? She's just too busy.
I can imagine. You know, she's in demand. I mean, how many centenarians are there at this point?
God bless her.
Has a date with Willard Scott somewhere. Well, this film, of course, was released in the middle of actually the 7th of June, 1946. So just 71 years ago this week. And that was it. But before we leave this particular film, I do want to point out two instances of, more of the boobus Britannicus from Watson. And the first, I think, is probably an unnecessary bit of sarcasm from Rathbone's Holmes, but it's also an unnecessary bit of Captain Obvious from Nigel Bruce.
I say, Holmes.
What?
It's morning.
Allow me to congratulate you on a brilliant bit of deduction.
Just a little too harsh. But then, you can understand why Holmes would be maybe at the end of his patience with Watson when he's greeted with this kind of activity.
Oh, darling, you mustn't cry anymore. Cheer up. Would you like to hear old Uncle make a noise like a duck? Oh, sorry?
I do have to fault Roy William Neal on one thing. At that point in the scene, I would have made the girl bawl her eyes out, having to deal with that.
Oh, but how lovely! Who knew Nigel Bruce could do a duck?
Many people. It was one of his favorite things to do on set.
That's great.
About that. Oh, but that's really where we reached the end of the collaboration. Rathbone later in his autobiography recalled that Sir Arthur felt at one time that he had created a sort of Frankenstein that he could not escape from. And so he decided to kill Mr. Sherlock Holmes at the Reichenbach Falls and to be done with him. Public outrage at this callous murder of Mr. Holmes by Sir Arthur was so great that Sir Arthur was literally forced to bring him back from the dead and continue the adventures. I frankly admit that in 1946 I was placed in a somewhat similar predicament, but I could not kill Mr. Holmes, so I decided to run away from him. However, to all intents and purposes, I might as well have just killed him. My friends excoriated me for my dastardly behavior, and for a while my long-time friendship with Nigel Bruce suffered severe and recurring shocks. And that is true. Bruce felt as if his friend abandoned him and kind of left him swinging in the breeze. And as far as the Universal contract went, Bruce was looking forward to those three other films that would have kept him employed throughout the year.
Yeah, and the whole thing was really rather pointless because 7 years later, Rathbone found at his particular age and with the body of work as Holmes behind him that other roles were difficult, although he did have, I think, at least one success in a longish-running stage play. But he was back in 1953 with his wife Ouida's play about Sherlock Holmes, which was to open at the New Century Theater in New York with Thomas Gomez, who we saw as the villain Meade in that very first picture, The Voice of Terror, the saboteur Meade. Oh. Thomas Gomez played Moriarty, and Rathbone dialed up Nigel Bruce in the hopes that he would accept the role of Watson, but sadly Nigel Bruce was not well, and a few weeks before that play was to open, and it did not last very long, Nigel Bruce passed away of a heart attack. He was only 58 years old.
And I want to touch on the irony of Ouida Rathbone's play Sherlock Holmes, which, by the way, was the subject of a Baker Street Journal Christmas annual, if I am not mistaken. In 2007, is that right? Yeah, the 2007 Christmas annual. It's not available for sale anymore. You can probably find it on eBay or ABE Books or something like that. But Ouida is the one who initially pressured Basil to drop out of the movie series, and she wrote the play that he could return to, and she was the one who was constantly spending his money just as quickly as he earned it. So it was an interesting relationship happening there. So you've got, unfortunately, this play not working out. It ran for rehearsals in Boston and then closed after only 3 performances in New York, followed fairly quickly by Nigel Bruce's death. But as the film relationship wrapped up in 1946, Rathbone also decided to exit the radio program, and the NBC found a new sponsor. Right, so Petri wine was out. It's now Kreml Hair Tonic, and Nigel Bruce was given top billing, and then the actor Tom Conway was brought to the scene. He actually arrived in Hollywood with his brother, whom you might know, one George Sanders. Oh, great film villain right there. But what was really interesting about the choice of Tom Conway as Sherlock Holmes was he sounded almost exactly like Basil Rathbone. It's uncanny.
Oh, Mr. Holmes, at last, thank heaven.
I beg your pardon.
You must save him. He didn't do it. I know he didn't. And they'll hang him. They'll hang him. No one in the world but you can help him now.
Now, my dear madam, you must control yourself. I can't possibly help you until I know your problem.
Oh, you must excuse me.
Here, my dear. You drink this. It'll make you feel better.
Oh, thank you. I've been waiting for you, Mr. Holmes, praying for your return for days. You left no forwarding address.
I know. Dr. Watson and I had promised ourselves a real holiday.
I'm Edith Fairmont. Evidently that name means nothing to you. You haven't seen the newspapers?
No, not for 4 weeks, thank him.
Compose yourself, madam, and tell us what has brought you here. And remember that we know nothing beyond the obvious facts that you are in great distress and, from your peril, recently widowed.
That's really amazingly close, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it is very close. And I think Tom Conway also picked up from his brother, George Saunders, on The Saint on the radio. I think he popped in there. But it is very close. And a lot of what gives it that verisimilitude of Rathbone is, of course, you have Nigel Bruce. So you're really looking for Rathbone there. So I think, it's remarkable.
Yes. Well, the entire series was remarkable, and it still holds a place dear in many Sherlockians' hearts and serves as, again, a place of entry for a number of people who discover Sherlock Holmes. So the work was amazing for its time, and still withstands the test of time.
And we're lucky to have it. The Universal films, I never realized this, were not lost, but in severely poor condition, and were all restored some years ago by the film. It's the UC Berkeley Film.
The Film Institute.
Institute.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
So we still have them.
We do. Thank goodness. If you'd like a living link to the times of Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce as Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, look no further than the Baker Street Journal. Since 1946, the final year of the collaboration between the two actors, the BSJ has been packing its pages with news, commentary, and analysis about the original stories and every manifestation of the great detective. Films, television, books, magazines, the internet, video games, and more. 4 times a year, plus a bonus Christmas annual, means that you'll never tire of playing the game. It's been more than 70 years since the duo last graced the screen together, and more than 70 years that this torrent of Sherlockian scholarship has been flowing. And while one might think that it would slow to a trickle in 2017, the fact is that the waters of creativity are roaring like a veritable Reichenbach Falls. Be sure that you partake of this long-standing tradition as we honor Rathbone and Bruce. You too can honor their memory and the memory of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson by going to BakerStreetJournal.com and getting a subscription today. Well, that seems to do just about as much damage as we can with all of our content here. We did not go over this at the beginning of the show, and it's worth noting now. If you would like to support our show, if what you've just heard is at all valuable to you, the reason it took us 122 episodes to get to this point is that the clip gathering, the research, having the time to put all this together and to do all of the work necessary behind the scenes, it takes some level of effort. And by the way, we did wait until episode 122, but if you actually reverse those numbers, that's 221. So it's entirely appropriate that we're here. Seems backwards that it took us so long to get to Rathbone, and yet 122 backwards is 221. But if you appreciate what we've done here, won't you consider supporting our show? We'll give you a couple of different options. There are on ihearofsherlock.com, there are two buttons in the upper right-hand corner there. You can press either one of them and either become a recurring sponsor through Patreon, which means that each time we publish an episode, we will send you an invoice, as it were, so you pay per episode. Or if you'd simply like to make a one-time donation, PayPal works just as well, too. You can click on that button, or you can just go to paypal.me/ihose and make a donation that way. And, of course, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to get your comments, get your feedback, get your thoughts on how we can continue to improve the show. You can reach us by email at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. You can reach us on any of the social platforms. We're I Hear of Sherlock in all of those. You can leave us a comment right on the show notes for this page, which are available at ihose.co/ihose122. And I think there is still one of those non-Alexander Graham Bell invented telephones involved, too, isn't there?
Oh, sure. Yes. Put your finger in that rotary dial and do 774-221-READ. That's 774-221-7323. We want to hear your voice. We know what we sound like. We want to hear you.
There you go. Well, thank you for staying with us for this extra long, extra special episode. Until next time here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, I'm Scott Monty.
And I'm still Bert Walder.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I'm neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.